when we go through big loss, it asks so much of us. It really asks us to evaluate what matters to us, who we are, who we want to be in the face of all this change, how we're going to get on our feet, how we're going to live our lives going forward. And when we can really kind of let those questions be asked, even though it's painful and it can be scary, then I think we really begin to transform into people that we may not have had the opportunity to be otherwise.
Hi, everyone. I'm joined by a special guest today, Claire Bidwell Smith. We met at the In-Group Health Summit not so long ago, where Claire was a guest speaker. Claire is an expert on grief, a licensed therapist, international speaker, and the author of 5 books, including Anxious Grief and Conscious Grieving. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to start by expanding on a topic that you touched on at the In-Group Health event around the feeling of loss and lack. So, for many people who want to make positive changes to their life and improve their wellness, they're setting about to adopt new habits and having to give up the old ones. And it can get very uncomfortable rewiring our neural pathways and doing things differently. It's uncharted territory. So, what would you suggest on how to approach any feelings of loss and frustration when people are giving up old, familiar, comfortable habits in order to embrace change and something new?
I think that's a great question. Loss really, or change is really about loss. We are moving on from things. We're giving things up, even when it's a good thing. Maybe we're changing jobs for something better, or we're leaving a relationship that wasn't working. There's still loss there. And with that comes grief. And I think a lot of the problems arise when we don't acknowledge that grief and don't let ourselves grieve, even something that again is better for us to let go of. We've all moved, multiple times. We've let go of friendships. We've changed schools. We watch our kids go through this. And I think when we make those transitions, it is really important to kind of acknowledge what that thing was that we were holding on to and to really kind of acknowledge all the feelings that come up. A lot of times there's fear and anxiety. We're making these big changes from something we're really used to and we've gotten very comfortable with it. Even if it's not serving us, we're kind of just in that comfortable space with it. And so we may have feelings of fear and also just sadness that arise. And when we push those away and try to ignore them and just barrel through, I think that's when we get into trouble. So let yourself feel some of that sadness. It doesn't mean you can't still make the change. It doesn't mean that it's not a good thing. But I think acknowledging that the sadness is coming, maybe, giving yourself some moments of gratitude for what it was that you had for a period of time that served you but no longer does. When we can just really acknowledge these things, I think it makes us better able to just move forward in healthy ways.
Mhm. That makes sense. And you have written such a beautiful book called Conscious Grieving.
Yeah.
And in this book, you have a section about transforming through grief. So, in life, the journey of change and transformation and experiencing a sense of wellness and fulfillment is often preempted by having to face some very real and difficult emotions. For myself, for many years, I avoided these emotions until they showed up in other ways, like health setbacks. So, what would you say to people who don't know how to approach this emotional soup that may be lurking under the surface?
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to a lot of different ways to run from it because it feels overwhelming. It feels like we're not going to be able to stop crying if we start, or that we're just going to fall down some rabbit hole and we won't be able to get back up on our feet. But really, the truth is, if we lean into these things, if we lean into grief, if we lean into change and loss, then I think we learn a lot. I think that the thing that's important to think about when I talk about transformation and grief, it's not always something that people want to hear in the beginning. If you've gone through a really big loss, whether you lost someone you love or you lost a job that was really important to you or your own health, we don't always want to hear about how it's going to be transformative at some point. But the truth is, it really is because when we go through big loss, it asks so much of us. It really asks us to evaluate what matters to us, who we are, who we want to be in the face of all this change, how we're going to get on our feet, how we're going to live our lives going forward. And when we can really kind of let those questions be asked, even though it's painful and it can be scary, then I think we really begin to transform into people that we may not have had the opportunity to be otherwise. That said, one caveat is that I think we really need support sometimes. You don't have to do this alone. I think people try to soldier on with this alone. Find a therapist or a counselor, find a support group, listen to podcasts and watch videos like this and really kind of get some support and normalize what you're going through so it doesn't feel so scary.
Nice. And how do we know when we might be avoiding or numbing out difficult emotions? What are some of the telltale signs?
I think, like you said, it'll show up in other ways. It spills out, usually in anxiety or usually in irritability and anger, frustration. If you find yourself feeling really jealous or resentful of other people, those are signs that we're kind of avoiding what's really going on underneath. If we're feeling secure and happy and satisfied with ourselves, we don't have those feelings. We don't get angry and resentful and jealous and anxious. So we have to address the stuff that's coming up. Why are those things? What are you anxious about? What are you jealous of? What is it you're needing? Sometimes we have a young version of ourselves that just needs love.
Mhm.
We really need to do a better job at showing ourselves compassion in so many different areas of our lives and kind of meeting ourselves where we are. None of us are perfect. We're all a work in progress. And we're constantly trying to get to this better version of ourselves, but we're kind of bypassing where we are right now. So meet yourself right here and right now in like this version of who you are. And then you can help yourself move forward.
Thank you for sharing that. And it reminds me, I noticed that we both kind of talk about a topic, and that's the need to surrender at the right times. So it can feel so difficult to release the need for perfection or to be in control all the time. So, as a grief specialist, I think we can glean so much insight from what you could share with us about how you guide people in practicing surrender.
Surrender surrender is really interesting. It's really important, but I think it's hard to get to. And often we're almost forced to a point of surrender. And it happens when we realize we've been really fighting or resisting something. When I think about it in terms of grief, I see someone go through a big loss and they immediately try to get their hands around it. They read all the books about grief. They find a grief therapist, they get on top of everything and they're trying to control it. They want homework from me. And then at some point they realize that they're trying so hard to do all of these things, and yet this process is so much bigger than maybe they anticipated or they want it to be. And at some point you just have to let go and you have to let it be what it is. And that's when we surrender. And when we surrender, I think we stop gripping it so tightly and we really let ourselves ask those questions. We let ourselves acknowledge that we're not going to be who we were before. There's no going back to who we were. We're moving forward and it's going to look different and it's going to feel different. And there's going to be things we let go of along the way. And that's the surrendering.
Nice. Yeah, moving forward and just going into that unknown territory can be really scary and difficult at times. So, talking about emotions and being in touch and knowing how we really feel under the surface, how important is it for women to carve out time for reflection or inner work? And do you have any tips on how to approach this and how often? In my work with cycles, I talk about at least once a month having like a deep dive, a quiet, a solitude to kind of tap into your inner world. So, what would you suggest around that for
I love
women?
that. Yes, once a month for sure, a deep dive, but then smaller ones along the way too. In this age of technology, I think it's more important than ever to be very intentionally carving out that time. It can be as simple as starting a new practice where you don't look at your phone first thing in the morning. Make sure you don't have that thing in your hands for at least 20 to 30 minutes. Wake up, open your eyes, breathe, be in the world, drink some coffee, have your own independent thoughts. The minute the phone's in our hand, we are having thoughts that are reactions to what we're seeing on the phone, things we're reading, pictures we're seeing, images. And when we can just wake up and have a pure experience of kind of ourselves in the world, I think that's really important because that's allowing us the time and the space to just really be with ourselves and not with all this outside noise that's constantly coming in. When I think about this with grief too, grief is something we really have to make space for. It doesn't always make its own space. Sometimes it does, but in really overwhelming ways where you're walking across a room and suddenly you're in tears and you weren't expecting it. But we can also carve out time to be intentional with our grief. We can take a deep dive once a month. We can sit down and we can look through photos and we can write a letter to our person. We can kind of call up our grief.
Mhm.
And when we make that space for it, it's less likely to overtake us in unexpected ways the rest of the time. So, yes, all of that for sure. I love that you advise that.
Yeah, and you talk about rituals in your book as well. So creating that ritual of going through the photos and allowing yourself to remember the person and having it as part of your life and not kind of avoiding it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the upside of dealing with all this inner work and reflection. So can you share any ways that we can make this more enjoyable or just feel less heavy and daunting when we're facing our emotions, whether it's grief or whatever else is lurking there? Like, how can we be inspired to do this?
Hmm. I think taking the pressure off of it being like this big overhaul we have to do on our lives, right? So if you're listening to this and you're someone who really hasn't made a lot of space for intentional feeling and grieving and all of these things, it doesn't have to be like you start tomorrow and everything is different. Start tomorrow and make it small, do 5 minutes of meditation, do 5 minutes of writing, just do 5 minutes of something that doesn't feel overwhelming. The positive reinforcement that you'll get from those 5 minutes, it feels so good. It's like every time when I love yoga, but it's sometimes so hard for me to get out the door and get to class. But then the minute I'm there, I'm like, oh, I need to do this every day. And so it's the same feeling. It's like when you do carve out these little bits and pieces for yourself, they themselves serve as the reminder and the inspiration to keep doing it. But again, like don't make it too hard on yourselves. Get an app that like has a guided meditation, find some writing prompts so you're not staring at a blank page. We don't have to make this super hard. We can do little bits and pieces that feel good.
Mhm. So it's kind of like a self-care routine. It's caring for ourselves, giving ourselves space.
Absolutely. I mean, schedule it if you have to. I have
Mm.
a super busy calendar, and sometimes I realize that the calendar is going to fill up if I don't take pieces out. So I'll actually schedule like 9 a.m. meditation, and then nothing else goes in that slot. And I'm like, oh, I saved some meditation time for myself.
Yes, and I love what you said about waking up and living with intention. It's almost like a fast forward because if you're getting distracted by having your phone on and not creating these sacred spaces for ourselves, then everyone else's agenda kind of becomes our agenda. We don't have our intention. So it's very powerful to create these spaces, do you think?
I agree. Absolutely. Writing is one of my favorite tools too. I use writing in so many different ways. In grief, writing letters to people that we've lost or just journaling. But just often, you can find that if you start putting pen to paper, it really accesses different parts of the brain to be writing. And when we do that, a lot will kind of come up that we weren't anticipating, or maybe something we were feeling but couldn't quite pinpoint comes out in the writing. And again, you don't have to be a perfect writer. You don't have to write for an hour. Just put pen to paper for a few minutes and see what comes up.
Yeah, I love that. It kind of gets it out of our body as well and onto paper,
Mhm.
no matter what we do with the paper, right?
Absolutely.
One of my favorite parts of your book is the concept that two things can be true at the same time. So we can feel angry at someone and still love them. We can wish that something difficult never happened, but we can also appreciate who we became because of that. And I find that such an intuitive, feminine, and compassionate way of seeing things. Our
Mm.
emotions are not always distinct or so ordered, they can be messy and fluid. And we can feel two things at the same time. So, this really allows for a sense of freedom and how we view ourselves and invites curiosity about our feelings. So I loved that concept. Can you talk more about like having these two, almost opposite emotions happening at the same time?
Yeah, I love that you love that. I think it's really important to remember. I'll see a lot of people kind of get stuck because maybe they had a difficult relationship with someone they loved. And so they feel like they're only supposed to focus on those difficult emotions. And then to remind them that they can love them and miss them and have had a difficult relationship. We can have complex feelings about all kinds of things in life. But I really believe, especially as women, we can hold multitudes. And when we try to limit ourselves to feeling one thing, it doesn't really serve us at all.
Yes, people are complex, and so it makes sense that we feel different things about people. Thank you so much for giving us an insight on all of this. Is there anything you wanted to add for people who are kind of wanting to change, wanting to transform, wanting to, address feelings that are maybe keeping them stuck and moving forward?
Yeah, just allow yourself some of that grief. I think that's the missing bridge between moving from one part of who you were to the next part. There is grief in between, and it may be unexpected grief. Again, maybe you're leaving something that is a good thing to leave, a bad relationship. Some part of your life that was holding you back, and you're moving on towards good things and you are excited. You still get to grieve, though. You still get to grieve your former self, the ways that that thing served you, that way of being in the world. And so just allowing those feelings to come up rather than pushing them away, I think enables you to move forward in such a cleaner, healthier way.
Yes. And I saw it written somewhere that, for someone like me who was avoiding grief, you can see it as kind of a wave. Like you're not going to go into a black hole. It's not going to last forever. And when I think of it as a wave and I allow myself to cry and express emotion, it kind of washes through and then something changes and it dissipates.
Mhm.
I'm
That's
sure it's more
exactly right.
complex than that, but is that a
No,
helpful visual, do you think?
it's so helpful because you're right. I think we feel that wave coming on and it feels like a tsunami, right? We're just
Mhm.
going to get just swept away with it. But the truth is, it's like going to the ocean and having a wave wash over you, and it can like tumble you around a bit. And then you come up for air again and you stable yourself. And then maybe another one comes, or maybe it's a while before the next one. And I think if we can remember that, we're able to really kind of ride through them much better.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. And please tell us a little bit about your books and if you have any in-person or online workshops or retreats that you're hosting soon or any other services that you offer.
Yeah, thank you again for holding space for this conversation. There's 5 books I've written now about grief and loss. They're all available anywhere books are found. You can find more on my website, clairebidwellsmith.com. I have an in-person retreat coming up in August. I have online support groups, one-on-one work, all kinds of offerings. I'm really striving all the time to kind of provide as much conversation around grief and space for it and support as I can.
Thank you so much. I'll drop the links below as well in the video that we mentioned. So I appreciate your time. You have such a beautiful energy. Thank you for joining me today and for the powerful tools and concepts that you shared.
Thank you so much for having me.